All right, I'm going to start going live now, and I'll let you guys know when we're officially live. Oh boy, computer is really groggy. Chris, do you want to start letting people in out of the waiting room?
Sure. Am I safe to admit all?
Yes.
Looks like it. Okay. Hello, everyone. I just want to welcome you here. We're waiting for our friends on Facebook to join us, and then we'll officially get started.
Okay, we're live.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's information session. I'm Christopher Reiki-Boucher, and I am the president of the Canadian League of Composers, and I'm really pleased to be here today hosting this discussion on writing for harpsichord with Wesley Shen here. I'd like to take, not only am I president of the Canadian League of Composers, but I'm also a composer myself and have had the pleasure of writing for harpsichord, so I'm really excited to be here today. I'd like to take this moment here to acknowledge the various and diverse indigenous cultures that we have across this full country. Coming up to our CLC, our Canadian League of Composers AGM, I've been tasked with trying to come up with an acknowledgement that serves everyone all across the country. But that has actually proven to be a very difficult task based on the diversity of Indigenous cultures that we have in this country here. So what I would like to do is I'm going to acknowledge that I am a settler and an uninvited guest here on the territories of the Lekwungen speaking people. I do this here out of respect and honor to the Indigenous people in my region, as well as the lands that I am on, and to honor the protocols specific to my region. I would encourage everyone to take a moment and just think about the protocols and acknowledgements that are specific to the regions and places that you might find yourself at this time. In the event that you're not sure what is appropriate for you in your specific region, I would encourage you after today's meeting to go out and research what are the appropriate acknowledgements and protocols for where you may find yourself. Some of you might be joining us for the first time and might not be aware of what the Canadian League of Composers does. We are an organization that efforts to speak on behalf of all Canadian composers and be a voice to funding bodies, as well as do instigate initiatives that help with equity and working conditions for all composers across Canada. Some people may know us as the people that maintain a standard of fees for composers across, but we have also do other initiatives looking towards advocacy as well as equity within our field. So please do check out our website and have a look at the various things, everything from our stance on gender equity in contemporary music, to our call, our guidelines for creating professional calls for composers across Canada. And everyone should feel free to reach out if you have questions about what it's like to be working as a composer in Canada. Today we are joined by Wesley Shen, who is a versatile Toronto-based musician who does a varying number of solo chamber and chamber works. He's known for being able to play a variety of keyboards, not only harpsichord, but also piano, clavichord, and toy piano. He plays with a trio of recorders of viola da gamba and viola da gamba in the group Ugly Pug, and has appeared on CDs, notably the Toy Piano Composers Collective's debut album. I'm really pleased to join him here and hear about the ins and outs of writing for harpsichord. We will have the opportunity for questions throughout today's chat. The way that if you have a question you'd like to submit, please, if you're joining us on Zoom, put your question in the Zoom chat. If you're joining us on Facebook, please put your question in the Facebook chat there, and we will make sure that the question gets forwarded on to Wesley. Feel free to submit your questions in either official languages of English or French as well. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge that like many organizations, we are funded with the support of the Canada Council of the Arts, the Ontario Arts Council, and the SOCAN Foundation. Their support makes it possible for us to do things like this, as well as the support of our donors. So thank you all very much for those that have helped us out here. So I think that is all I want to say at this time, and would like to turn the screen over to Wesley.
Thank you, Chris. I hope everyone can hear me all right. If there's any problems, just let me know. First, just to welcome you here in this virtual space that we're existing in. And I hope that I can offer some interesting sounds, interesting ideas to work around and to think about introducing the harpsichord into your life. Pour les francophones, bienvenue et merci de nous rejoindre. Si vous avez des questions en français et vous préfériez les poser en français, je peux vous répondre. Et merci de venir aujourd'hui. Before we start, I want to acknowledge that we are here in this virtual space sharing together because of the fact that we also have the ability to be safe and exist in a physical space. And right now there are a lot of people who are struggling and have been fighting for a long time and continue to fight to secure that type of security and that type of right to a physical space and to exist and take up space in their lives, and literally fighting for their lives. So definitely my support to Black Lives Matter, to Indigenous Lives Matter. Systemic racism and systemic discrimination exists in all our cultural and social structures, and we need to be mindful, we need to be aware, and we need to be accountable to how those things might benefit us and how those things might continue to oppress and continue to affect other people. In classical music, it's definitely been used throughout its history and still today as a form of politicization, as a form of weapons against minority voices, against other forms of artistic music. And I feel that very personally with the harpsichord, as it is sort of the time and an emblem of this, shall we say, golden age of Europe, which is really sort of the extreme spread of colonialization, the expansion of the empires, and oppression and genocide. So we definitely need to do the work ourselves and educate ourselves, to listen to the voices that need to be listened to, and really support and find solutions, find ways to long-lasting and continuous change and evolution and support for everyone. So starting off with this instrument here, I'm going to try and balance sort of practical measures in terms of writing for it, in terms of working with it, but also balance that with maybe more abstract artistic, philosophical ideas. For me, it's unfortunate that we have to do this in this virtual space, because I find being in the presence of the instrument, of the sound, being able to touch the instrument, being able to feel how it feels is really important to understanding how it works and to responding to it and working with it. So unfortunately, for the time being, I'll have to be your proxy with the instrument. When people think about harpsichord, a lot of what they think about are these very mechanical sounding, metallic things. I think John Cage compared it to a sewing machine. Someone talked about it sounding like skeletons copulating on a tin roof. So these are the kind of images we have of the harpsichord. The mechanisms are loud, the attack is sharp, and there's no sustain, there's no dynamics, which is probably the biggest thing that people think about with the harpsichord. The timbre is fixed. And nowadays, a lot of harpsichordists themselves shy away from new music, as there's so much music written for the instrument from the Baroque period that they can focus on, and composers are shy to approach harpsichordists for that same reason. For me, sorry, mind the doorbell. For me, I find that when I first encountered this instrument, the tone quality and the resonance of it was something that really changed my understanding of it. It's really something that is unique, it's really evocative, and really gave me a number of tools that I was lacking maybe in my piano playing, or lacking in my overall sound world and overall things I wanted to come across and project. There's the quietness of it, there's the sustain, there's the sort of cloud of resonance that it creates that really draws the ears toward it. So instead of the sound projecting out to an audience, it really pulls the audience in towards it and forces you to suspend your space and time and really draw into its unique sound, to its intimate qualities. At the same time, there's sort of the complete opposite, where it can really become a machine and really become a percussive and aggressive thing. And so this wide range of abilities really gives almost a human quality to it, in that we can express these wide ranges of things, even despite what we normally think of as expressiveness, which is dynamic and tone and timbre. The harpsichord, it forced me, and it forces a lot of people to find alternative ways and other dimensions of sound that we can control and we can play around with to create all the nuances that we want. And for me, that really brought to life the instrument. It really forced me to explore things in very different ways. So what is this instrument? A lot of people are not quite sure what it is, and have no idea what the mechanics are. As you can see, there's a bar here which covers all the mechanics, so even if you were to look in, it's very hard to see what's happening. But what we essentially have is a big box. This is a large closed box with strings sitting under tension on top on a soundboard. And so all the sound projects into this large box, which resonates and fills whatever hall we're working in. And then under here we have what actually creates the action, which is these little things here are called jacks. And so these are actually what pluck the string. So the keys we have here are just a simple lever, just go back and forth, up and down. And sitting on the other end is this jack. So let's see if I can focus it. Which are little pieces of wood, sometimes plastic nowadays, that go up and down. And right here you can see, potentially, a little thing sticking out, which is the plectrum, and that's what actually plucks the string. Traditionally, they were made with bird quill, with leather sometimes. Nowadays, we often use plastic because it's a little bit more accessible and cheap, but many people still use quill. And what we do is this little thing will, when we push the key down, this goes up and flexes and plucks the string. And then on its way down, you can see maybe that it is sitting on a little piece of wood sitting inside this jack that can actually move back and forth. Maybe you can see that. And it's again a little lever that goes like this, and what that allows to do is that when the string, when we release the key and the jack comes down, it clears the string, so it doesn't pluck both ways. And then this little red thing here is the damper, and so when we release the key, the string is dampened and the sound stops. In a lot of ways, I like to compare the harpsichord more to the organ than to the piano, because a lot of things are much more similar in terms of sort of an even dynamic and on-off type thing. And even the touch is sometimes more similar to an organ, where there's a bit of resistance when the plectrum is against the string, and then a complete release once you clear the string. And for this reason, that we have this tiny little piece of plastic plucking the string is sort of the dynamic limitations, is that we have to voice the plectrum, which means we shave off parts of the end to make it flex in a nice way that plucks the string in a full resonant tone. If we voice it too weak, where it bends too quickly, then we'll get a weak tone. We won't get sort of the full bloom of sound. If we voice it too hard, we'll get a loud sound, but we'll also get a more harsh, sort of aggressive, sometimes very sharp sound, and sort of an over-aggressiveness on the string. If you think of Bartok pits, if you think of sort of really striking a guitar string, you end up with a very sharp, sometimes dirty sound, which is enjoyable sometimes, which is needed sometimes, but in general, when we're looking, especially on these historical instruments, we're looking for more melodious, more harmonious sounds. We want sort of to find that balance between not too light, but not too heavy. I'm just gonna put this back under the jack rail. Maybe you can't see this. Later on, if we have time, I can move the camera around and I can show you the inside of the instrument. I will just play a quick sound, just so you can hear. Sort of get an idea of what sound we're dealing with. Back to some practicalities. We have strings in here. They're very fine wire, usually made out of brass or iron. And some instruments have all brass, some instruments have a combination of brass and iron. It really depends on the type of harpsichord. Generally, we have one string per key. So when I play this one note, there's one string being plucked. A lot of instruments will have sets of strings. So they'll have 2, 3, sometimes 4 sets of strings that allow you to add more sound. More strings will be vibrating and you'll get more sound out of the instrument. Sometimes those strings are of different length to give octaves of a at-pitch sound. And in terms of notational and speaking in terms of these sets of strings, we use organ terminology. So a set of strings, or a set of pipes in the instance of an organ, are called 8-foot stops, or 8-foot registers, or 8-foot registrations. And so when you hear 8-foot, that refers to an at-pitch. If we half that number, the strings are half as long and they're going to sound an octave higher, so we call that a 4-foot. And vice versa, if we double that length and we go to 16-foot, that's going to sound 1 octave lower. And so depending on the harpsichord, you'll have different combinations of these sets of strings that you can engage at different times and give you a variety of colors of sounds. So this will come up later, so if it's not quite clear, I'll be explaining it again when I show you some pictures of other instruments and sounds of other instruments. The other thing that this one does not have, this one has one single keyboard and one set of strings. A lot of instruments will have 2 keyboards, sometimes even 3 keyboards, that again give us variety and give us possibilities of combining different sounds in different ways. In a lot of modern pieces, it also gives us the chance to play right on top of each other in the same range, which gives some interesting coloristic effects. Now I'm talking very generally because the challenge with the harpsichord is that there is no standard harpsichord. We're dealing with an instrument that existed from about the turn of the 1400s until the end of the 1700s. So that's close to 400 years of existence and 400 years of evolution, 400 years of national variances, national aesthetics that dictate how they wanted to build the instruments, and 400 years of experimentation with new technology, new ideas, new sounds. So to talk about harpsichord is a very misleading term because you could ask what harpsichord, what time period of harpsichord, what country of harpsichord, and everyone is going to be a little bit different. On top of that, when we revived the harpsichord in the early 20th century, it sort of brought about a whole new type of harpsichord, which was inspired by piano technology. So they were building heavier cases, sometimes more strings to get all the orchestral effects they wanted, pedals to be able to change some of the sounds quickly while we're playing. But with all that heavy construction, we changed the sound of the harpsichord quite a bit. So for a lot of people, these are no longer in fashion, no longer desired. The sound is quite thin, quite metallic. The resonance is very little because of so much tension, so much heavy construction. And we lose some of the sensitivity of the touch, where they were really using sort of heavy piano action and looking for these big sort of massive sounds and massive colors, which is sort of contradictory to the thinness of the actual sound in the end. But for me, it's a unique instrument on its own. It has a very clear, metallic, almost electronic sound, which can be really desirable in a lot of places. If I'm playing any music by Xenakis, it's almost necessary to have this instrument. And the objectiveness, the sort of thinness of the sound really matches the aesthetic he was going for. I'm going to show you an example of this instrument just to get an idea of how it sounds. And it's really, this is sort of the sound that a lot of people think about when they think of harpsichord.
Hey Wesley, sorry to just interrupt.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just double checking that you had shared the audio because nothing was coming up, but it's good now.
Yeah, it just took a little while, sorry.
It's quite loud. Heads up, everyone.
I will turn it down a bit. Sound. So you can hear it's quite a colorful sound, quite a spread sort of sound. He's using a lot of registrations, but it's quite a, for me and for a lot of people, especially in person, it's quite a thin sound. It's quite a nasal sound, and there's very little sort of resonance and bloom to that sound, which nowadays is not so favorable amongst early musicians. But if you think of Xenakis's or Ligeti, even his sound world, this could match quite nicely and could work very well in those cases. But for today, I really want to focus on, the historical styles of instruments and sort of the possibilities with these instruments. There's a lighter action, a lighter construction, which for me is often more pleasurable and easy to play. It gives me more sensitivity to the touch. It gives me more options to play and respond to the varieties of sound, to the bloom of the sound, and to the resonance that it creates in a room and within itself. So we're going to focus on these types of instruments. I do play a lot of these revival instruments as well, but that might be a topic for another day. So I want to just give a brief outline of some of the different types of harpsichords. There's endless different variations of range, variations of registration, sets of strings, variations of tone colors, but I want to give a general sense of some of the variety. So first off, I'm going to divide it into two very broad categories of instruments from the Baroque period, which is mostly Northern Europe, including French, the Flanders, the Lowlands, and Northern Germany, and sometimes England, and the South, which is mostly Spain, Italy, Austria, and some of the southern parts of Germany. So first with the South, we have much smaller instruments, much lighter construction, and much simpler design. They're looking for a very clean sound, very consistent sound across all the range and with all the registrations that they might use. The stringing is generally made in all brass through the whole range. And what that means is, for me, I find the sound is a bit fatter, a bit fuller, more fundamental tone to it, but also a bit sort of more dirtiness to it, a bit more beefiness to it. I'm going to show a brief sample of someone playing some music from that so you get an idea of the sound, and then we'll compare it to the northern style. also these links. These are from YouTube videos. I can send them so people can see, get a better idea, and I can send other links to other types of instruments in case people are interested. But you can tell it's sort of a broader sound. The room is very resonant, which also helps to expand that sound. But it's very clear, it's very transparent at the same time. It works very well for counterpoint. I find it's really beautiful. And also if you play very dense chords in accompaniment, you get a very rich sort of velvety sound, which is really lovely. And in contemporary music, you can really extrapolate and really expand and play around with those ideas if you ever encounter an instrument such as that. The other instrument I want to show is sort of a northern style. Generally, we think of French instruments, mostly from the 18th century, as well as German instruments. And these are larger instruments. These are really what developed sort of the solo Baroque harpsichord music of Couperin, of Bach, of Handel. And we have both brass in the bass to give that beefiness and that warmth, but then as we go into the treble, we move to iron strings, which gives more clarity, more sharpness, and more projection, and allows for all that melodic content to really come to the fore and really sort of expand out. They also really enjoyed a large variety of different sounds, and so they were experimenting with where the jacks are placed on the string. Do you plug it closer to the end of the string to get more nasal sound? Do you plug it more towards the middle to get a fuller fluty sound, almost like a organ flute? And then also putting paper on the strings to get a buzz, putting metal against the string to buzz, putting pieces of leather to mute the sound and get a what we call a lute stop. And so all these effects they were playing around with in these northern style instruments. And nowadays, these are really the solo instruments that a lot of people use, and it has sort of become the standard contemporary harpsichord. And so I want to describe that, and then I'll show you a video so you can get an idea of the sound. And at this point, we'll also talk about some of the registration ideas that people are always interested in with the harpsichord and how that works on the keyboard. So typical harpsichord in terms of a contemporary modern harpsichord is a French double manual or a German double manual, which has a range from F, 4 lines below the bass clef, to F, the 3 lines in a space above the treble clef. 2 manuals, as I mentioned, and generally the sets of strings are 2 sets of 8-foot strings, so 2 different sets of strings at pitch, and 1 set of string that's 1 octave higher, a 4-foot set of strings. We also have the option of a lute stop, which puts a little piece of leather against the string to make it sound like a lute. If you think of muting the end of a piano sound, it's very similar. And then we have what we call a shove coupler, in which the upper manual will push in, and then from the lower manual, we can play the top manual. So any sounds that are on the top manual will be played by the lower manual. This sounds all very abstract and confusing. I hope these videos that I'll show will show you all these varieties. And if there's any questions after, I can keep describing them. But for now, I'll show you a video of an original French double instrument. And I'll play this whole clip because he goes through a large variety of the sounds that you can do on this instrument. the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston with an original French instrument from 1730 something. But you can sort of hear the large variety of sound colors that they get. So he started on the lower manual alone, which has this sort of more full, more fundamental sound to it. And then you move to the upper manual, which is plucking a little closer to the end of the string, so you get a bit more shaded, a bit more nasal sound, almost a piano compared to the lower manual. And then what he did was he added what we call the lute stop. So on the upper manual, in this case, he pushed a few little pieces of leather against all the strings, which mutes them and gives you that lute stop on the upper set of strings, on the upper 8-foot strings of the upper manual. And then after that, he pushed the keyboard in, which doubled up, which coupled the keyboards. And you could see that when he was playing on the bottom keyboard, the upper keys were moving at the same time. And so whatever you play on the bottom, the upper keys will move, and any strings that are being plucked by the upper keyboard, which in this case is the 1 8-foot, will be also played by the lower one. So you get a fuller sound of both 8-foot strings playing at the same time. Lastly, he added the 4-foot set of strings, which gave even a fuller, more robust, what we call the tutti registration, because it's all the strings playing, and gives sort of a very full, very robust, colorful sound. There are still more combinations, because you could have the lute stop, bring it down, and then have the 4-foot, which gives you a different combination. You could have the 8-foot from the lower manual, the 8-foot from the upper manual with the lute, which gives you another combination. There's very many combinations of sounds, which gives you all these different colors to play around with, and sort of different orchestrations, shall we say, of the harpsichord. There's one other sound I want to show, which is the 4-foot alone. And he doesn't show on this because I don't think the instrument can do it. But from another piece, this is a piece by Monica Pierce, it's just show a short clip to get you the idea of the sound quality of the 4-foot alone. So you can hear it's very sharp, very fine. It actually extends the range of the harpsichord up 1 octave, because that upper range is pitched an octave higher. But it's a very delicate sound. Sometimes even the sound of the mechanism becomes louder than the actual strings themselves, which can be an interesting thing that Ligeti expands about in his continuum at the end, where you're playing only on the 4-foot right at the top, and the sound of the key clicking is sometimes even louder than the actual pitch that you hear. So in summary of this instrument, I want to show this picture here, which sort of shows the basic arrangement of these registrations. I hope this is clear. I'll just describe it quickly. On the lower manual, which we often call manual 1, we have a set of 8-foot strings at pitch and a set of 4-foot strings that we can use. On the upper manual, we have just a set of 8-foot strings, but we can affect that set of strings with the lute stop.
Wesley, the image isn't coming through. Can you adjust your share settings?
Yes, let me try that. Sorry. Did the other video come through okay?
The videos have all come through. Yeah, it's just this photo.
Let me try this again. Sorry.
No worries.
How's that?
Good.
Is that coming through?
Yeah, it's there.
Great. So what we can see is on the lower manual, which we call manual 1, we have a set of 8-foot strings and a set of 4-foot strings. On the upper manual, which we call manual 2, we just have a set of 8-foot strings, but we can affect that set of strings with a lute stop. And on this instrument, the switch for the lute stop is right here in the middle, where I say switch for lute stop. Some instruments, it's actually inside the body of the instrument, so you have to sort of reach your hands in near the pins and turn it on. For the lower manual, we can turn off one or both of the 4-foot and the 8-foot. On the left side of the image is for the 8-foot and the right side is the 4-foot, so you can switch those on or off. And for coupling the keyboard, so for connecting the top keyboard to the bottom keyboard, we have what we call a push coupler. And so the upper keyboard will be pushed in. And you can see here on the right edge, you can see sort of a gap between those two brass knobs on the right side of the upper keyboard. So the keyboard is actually pushed in, so we can pull it out to uncouple those keyboards. So this is sort of the general outline of standard, shall we say, for lack of a better word, contemporary harpsichord. But it's a really important, if you are writing for harpsichord, to talk with the harpsichordist to ask what sort of options are available to you, what sort of range the instrument has, what sort of registrations, what sort of sound it has, what type of instrument it is. And I think it's important to know because that'll affect how the piece might be able to be played. There's ways where you could write more generally to allow a broader range of instruments to be included in the piece, but that limits maybe how much control and what you can do, or you have to specify what type of instrument you are writing for, and then the performer will have to look for that specific instrument. But at the same time, I think it's really an interesting exploration, interesting chance to really respond and react with the instrument that you're given as an option. And really, if you can have a chance to sit down with the instrument you're going to be writing for, really respond to its unique capabilities, its unique voice, and really come up with something that fits that instrument. And then if that piece can be transferred to another instrument, you'll have almost a fully different piece and a fully different interpretation of that work, with the different colors, the different sounds, the different characteristics of that other harpsichord. And so I think it's really an option to engage in this non-standardization that we lack a lot in our modern world, in our modern instruments, and really engage with the unique capabilities of each individual instrument. So if there are any questions now, I can take a few questions before I move on to sort of my next section. If not, we can continue and we can have more questions at the end as well.
Yeah, so I'd like to remind everyone that we are taking questions through the chat functions here. So Wesley, one that seems to be right on topic as to what we just talked about. Is there any 16-foot strings on the French and German double manual instruments?
Yes, that's a good question. So there are a lot of instruments from the period that had 16-foot strings. Nowadays, a lot of builders have shied away from the 16-foot string. I think mostly because the earlier instruments, those big pedal instruments that we had from the middle of the 20th century, mostly all had 16 foot. So there's almost a negative connotation to the 16 foot with the builders who have gone back to historical instruments. So unfortunately, they aren't as common. The other reason is practicality. They take a lot more space. The construction is heavier or more expensive. Mostly the instruments become heavier, so there's a practicality element to it. But there are a few builders who build now with 16 foots. And if you're working with a revival instrument, with an instrument from before, sort of a non-historic instrument, those generally will have 16-foot stops. But you sort of have to talk with the harpsichordist that you're working with. In general, no, nowadays, unfortunately. It is a very magical sound, but we sort of work with what we have.
Excellent. Thank you. Now, you touched a little bit earlier on about dynamics and what is possible there. I'm going to read the question. This was one that came in before we started speaking today. So the question is, a friend of mine told me I could do dynamics on the harpsichord, though very slightly. Is this true? Because every book says the opposite. That we can, for example, roll a chord to give the sensation of a forte, but not explicitly a real forte.
Yeah, so there's sort of two elements of that. I will cover a lot of that coming up as well. In general, no, there isn't so much control. If you do, there are very subtle dynamics, and it really depends on the instrument, depending on how fast you pluck. But generally, the faster you pluck, the quicker the string is starting to resonate, and it often loses out on the possibility to sort of fully bloom into its full sound. This is a debate that we talk about a lot with early music, is whether some people believe dynamics are real, some people believe they're not. And it really, for me, it comes down to the context that it's in, is that there's ways of shaping the notes to make them forte based on what we do around those notes. And from a composer standpoint, with chords, for example, if you play more notes in the chord, you're going to obviously have a louder dynamic because there's more strings ringing. So oftentimes people will create a denser chord in order to have a louder sound, whereas find a thinner chord to to make it less so. And that's something that we often do in continuo in accompanying, is that we'll base the number of voices depending on how full and how loud we want the chords to be, and how loud, what dynamics we want to have. For me, in my experience, which I will get into right now, is that it's mostly contextual dynamics that we do, and we create not only illusions, but realities based on the resonance, based on the articulations we choose for the instrument. I hope that answers the question.
I think so. I think it's a very beautiful thought about debating whether or not dynamics are real. I think that's a really, really wonderful idea. I don't have any questions coming at me right now that I think would be, but we can have more questions at a later stage in the talk there.
So I'd like to move on and talk a bit about my approach to the harpsichord, not in terms of my philosophy, but in terms of the things I often think about when I'm playing harpsichord, and the sort of technical aspects I'm either doing intuitively or thinking of explicitly. And really sort of the question is, what do I do in order to shape musical ideas and to create the illusion of dynamics, to create literal dynamics, to create the shape of the music, and to express what I want to express. And to keep it brief, I'm just going to sort of show some of the varieties of things that I can do, and I'll play a bit as well so we actually can hear a live instrument. But sort of touch on the idea of articulation, the idea of time and rubato, and a Gothic accent as a form of expression, and talk a bit about the thing that we always think about with harpsichord is arpeggiation in terms of chords. So our main tool as harpsichordists is articulation, is varying the length of notes, varying the space between each individual note in order to shape and to create texture, to create variety that gives an art shape, gives whatever shape we want to give to the music. And also allows us to create the sense of accent, dynamic, crescendo, etc. So if we think of sort of the spectrum of articulation, we have staccato at one end, and we have extreme legato at the other end, to the extreme where we actually hold all the notes individually down as we play them. And between that, we have almost infinite variety of perceptible and imperceptible differences of articulation. That's only in terms of the length of the note. We can also then include the space between each note. So if we have two notes, that space in between can be of different lengths, and that will also affect how we perceive the relationship between those notes, and the dynamic relationships and accentual relationship between those notes. So if we think about lightening and creating something more light versus creating something more heavy, we can use both, in that if we overhold all the notes, it gives it more weight, it gives it more sound, which makes it louder, which makes it heavier. But if we compare that to something that's short, that we can have that shortness make the over legato feel heavy. Or if we have big sounds and then this over legato, we can actually make that feel lighter. On the other end, staccatos can feel both light and can feel also very accented, depending on the context. So if we think of slurring a bunch of notes together, if we hold those notes down, there's going to be a continual sense of sound going, which makes any subsequent note that we play feel quieter in relation. Whereas if we separate them, we have this sort of loud attack on each individual note. Whereas if we're holding down, the sort of baseline level of volume clouds some of the accent, making those extra notes feel quieter, feel maybe lighter. On the other side, if we do separate each note, it's almost giving that space that allows the next note to feel like stronger, feel louder, feel accented. So there's a lot of different ways that we're thinking about articulation in order to create things stronger, softer, louder, lighter, accented, unaccented. And context is really determinant of that. But it's often an intuitive thing that we do and that we try to do, or we have to consciously think, okay, I want to accent this note, so I'm going to separate before this. Or I want to unaccent these notes, so I'm going to slur them together. I want to show an example, and I'll play it as well. Let me know if this is visible, this example here. This is from Ligeti, from Hungarian rock. And mostly I want to focus in on, let's see if I can zoom in, on the upper 3 lines. I have a few markings here and there, but sort of the end of the first line through the second and third. And so he's written long phrases, but then these groups of 2s and 3s. And if I were to play that with the full legato, I'll play it right now. So I played it sort of almost fully legato. I played a few accents, unfortunately. I'm just going to get it on my iPad so I can not have to turn and play. But I think if we do it that way, we lose out on a lot of opportunities to define these different rhythmic groups. And so I sort of showed in a few places where I would want to create accent, where I would want to subphrase some of these longer phrases. And even with these beginning groups of 2s and 3s, I would want to sort of emphasize that interplay of 2s and 3s. And whereas on a piano or another instrument, you could do that with accent, with dynamic, on the harpsichord, we generally have to do that with articulation. So I would sort of avoid these long phrases that he's written and do that more in spirit and more in intention, and articulate these various little groups so that we get this definition of articulation of the groups and of the different interplay of things that he's actually writing. So I'll play it again and exaggerate how I might actually perform it. So hopefully that's audible, but sort of just creating more space and more variety and more texture within this longer line of sort of tension building through these 2s and 3s. And so these are a lot of things that we think about and that we use to create shape in, sorry, I'm looking down at my computer screen, just create shape in these phrases and to sort of break up a long line and keep the long phrase, but give it definition, give it articulation, give it variety, give it color and energy. You might have noticed some of the things I was playing, I was taking a little bit of time as well, or rushing a few things. And that's my next point, is that we often will use time and rubato to create even more variety and another dimension of control of accent and the shape of the phrase. And so oftentimes if we wait on a note a little bit longer, it gives it that little bit more space to play and draws our ears to it and really accents or emphasizes that note in the idea of an accent or even just a tenuto. And so we are really working to sort of highlight the notes we want, and the other notes might sort of scurry along, or we just take that little bit of extra time and don't give it back, as we sort of think in traditional rubato, but sort of just take whatever time we need to do what we want to do, and really emphasize the notes that we want to come out of the texture, out of the sound. On the other hand, we can rush notes as well to sort of bunch them all together, which, if they're fast, can create an accent on its own, but also can sort of scurry them along so they're maybe less important. And that's sort of my next example here on page. Where is that page? I lost it. Here it is. So from bar 48, if you can see that, there's these accents on these lower notes of these rising lines. And so oftentimes what I will do is hold that just a little bit longer to really define that. And then even later on, ears will be drawn to it already, so I don't need to take as much time, but really sort of initialize that noticing of those points. So this is from a piece by Monica Pierce called Toile de Jouy, and I lost it in my own thing. Sorry, here we are. So I really want to highlight this line here. So I'm really going to sort of waiting on them in terms of my touch, but also taking the time I need for them to speak and really fill out their sound so that they're really accented. And then the other notes sort of follow after that. And so I'm responding to the sound and really filling out the notes with the time that they need. So these both pose a challenge for composers who do generally want to have a control and a sense of control over oftentimes the precise articulations, the precise timings, whether through polyrhythms, whether through very precise articulation. And this poses a challenge because I find if there isn't enough information, then I don't know what to do. If there's too much information, then I feel stuck by that and I can't necessarily shape the music in the way I want to, either with too much rhythmic intricacy or too much articulative intricacy. And so it's a funny balance between the two, but at the same time, we often define different polyrhythms, and whether we play sort of a quintuplet straight is often not the way that makes us feel it as a quintuplet. We often have to, in any music, alter the exact mathematical division of a quintuplet to make it sound more quintuplet-y. And so I feel that these sort of interpretive decisions that I'm making really are to highlight what is in the score and what the composer has given to me, and sort of offer my own expression of what is given. And so it's a fine balance, and it depends on from harpsichord to harpsichordist to harpsichordist and composer to composer. But it's definitely a dialogue that happens within a collaboration and within a performance of a new work for harpsichord. The last thing I want to talk about for my tools is arpeggiation, and this sort of combines articulation, time, and it really is looking at a vertical construction of sounds and how we spread that over time. Generally, we don't play it strict and together, because we lose sort of a dimension of control that we could have over how that sound develops over time. So we often will roll a chord, and we can decide how much we want to roll it, whether we space it over a long time, whether we do it faster, and to the extreme of where we play it all together. And that gives us another control. We can also spend a little bit of time in the middle, for example, to highlight notes that are not the top or the bottom. And sort of find different ways of varying our chords so that we can create different versions of it, and so that it's not all the same quick upwards roll. We can also change the order of the roll, or repeat notes several times. And we can sort of create this spinning of sound in space and in time that expands on this one harmony or this one vertical sound. So these are oftentimes the things that we think about when harpsichordists, when I am playing music, and especially with contemporary music, where the performance practice and the general sort of aesthetic is not always clear because every composer is different. And so finding new ways, and sometimes different ways from performance to performance, of interpreting and expressing these different ideas. And you always discover new things, discover new ways of doing things, and you have sort of a large vocabulary of possibilities. So my last little bit, I just want to show some pieces and just play a few things, and then hopefully leave enough time for more questions. But I want to pose these samples that I'll play in terms of just questions and things about composing for harpsichord. When I was approaching this topic, I sort of had an idea, but then at the same time I was like, how do you describe this is how you write for harpsichord? It's sort of a very obtuse, almost weird question to ask, because there is no one way to write for an instrument. And oftentimes the ways that you shouldn't write for the instrument become the most interesting ways to write for the instrument. I'm also of the mind that sort of idiomatic writing is usually not very interesting because it pulls off of sort of its history, and I would rather find someone who brings something completely new that I would have never thought of to the instrument, and really forces me to find ways of bringing that out of the instrument. So I'm remiss, I would rather not talk about this is what a harpsichord can do, this is what you should do with a harpsichord, but rather invite you to think about different concepts and different sort of abstract ideas I've thought about and that I enjoy thinking about in harpsichord playing, in harpsichord writing, and in harpsichord listening. And those main ideas are sort of texture, counterpoint. So thinking about texture in terms of the range from clarity to density, and what does that mean? The harpsichord is very good at creating very opaque, dense sounds, but the tone itself is also very transparent, very thin, and you can create very clear, very, very sparse counterpoint if you want to. The saturation, you can create very dense chords, or very, very empty chords. You can spread them out wide versus a more dense sorry, I'm talking and playing at the same time. A very wide sound versus a very dense proximal sound. And these result in very different things. Counterpoint can be sparse, can be clear and transparent, very sort of Bachian, shall we say, or it can become very leapy, very tangly, where the voices interrupt each other and overlap with each other, and you find almost new counterpoint coming out of these leaps, out of these different sort of tangles that come out of the music. So that's one aspect I like to think about a lot. And then it really plays into the second thing, which is resonance. And this instrument is really just a box. It's a box that resonates. And you might not be able to hear, but as I'm talking, the strings and the body is resonating from my voice. And so when I play a chord and release, there's this sort of after cloud of sound. And as you sustain notes, there's this cloud of sound that develops. And through sort of continual counterpoint, through non-continual counterpoint texture, you can develop this sound cloud and this resonant body of the instrument, and really respond to that and sort of create objects in sound that develop sort of a resonant existence, and really fills a room in different shapes, different architectures, different angles, and can be a really interesting way to approach this very resonant instrument. So I have a couple other things I just want to mention to clarify, practical things, but I want to play first so that you can hear some more. So I will find this piece, which most people will know. Hopefully you can see the screen. Continuum, which is really one of the first real successes and real exciting pieces for harpsichord from the 20th century. And Ligeti really found a whole new way of approaching the sound of the harpsichord in playing as fast as possible to create almost a continual band of textural sound that is alive and energetic and shifts throughout the keyboard. Off the beginning, I can't play it because I need two manuals, but there's a moment later on here where I can play it on one manual, and it's really where it starts to expand out to the edges of the keyboard. Becomes this very frenetic, very mechanical, but also very expressive in the control of the shapes and the control of the sonorities that he's working with, and really sort of shows off the wide variety of textural things you can do. A lot of pieces imitate this type of texture because it is very exciting and very enjoyable, but at the same time we can do the complete opposite, where it can be as complex harmonically but sort of create this very sparse, very spread texture. This is a piece by Klaus Stefan Mankoff, who's a contemporary harpsichord, contemporary composer out of Germany, and sort of belongs to the new complexist school. And it's a very different sound world where the sounds are very spread, very sparse, but equally, I find equally textural, equally exciting. So equally energetic, but in a very different form of texture that works very successfully, I think, on the instrument. And it really explores the registers. Each register has its very unique quality to it. And he really goes from the sort of very delicate top range to the very sort of beefy bass end, and really explores the entire range. The piece gets much more complex from here, but it's a very sort of launch for the beginning of the piece. On the other end here, we have a piece by Anna Hausmann, which these bottom 2 lines here explore a really interesting form of counterpoint. I find it's almost sort of 2 folk melodies that are just sort of wandering around each other, and it's this really free form of counterpoint, and it really explores the resonance of this range. Further on in the piece, she goes to this very expansive contrapuntal section where the voices are leaping over each other, and it's a very opposite style of color to the opening section, but equally creates this sense of playfulness. I find this section very sort of capriccioso-like and very, very fun as a contrast to the sort of much more subtle, much more meditative counterpoint to begin with. So I'll play from the bottom here at measure 15 and then jump over to the next section. Section, very different contrasting character. So it becomes a very different style, almost similar rhythm, similar density of rhythmic activity, but a very different character to it, that both sort of speak to the qualities of this instrument from both ends of its characters that you can reach. I'm having trouble because this instrument is actually at 415, A415, so it's a semitone lower than I'm used to hearing. I apologize to any perfect pitchers up to there. I'm sure you're struggling equally. The last 2 examples I want to show really explore sort of harmonic resonance and harmonic sound. The first one is by a French composer, Brice Posay, and he's really experimenting. He's a harpsichordist himself. He's really experimenting with the French style of preluding, where it's very free harmonies that you're exploring and chord shifts, but he does it in a very atonal way, in a very new complexist way, where he's trying to dictate, not dictate, but sort of explain the precise rubato and length of notes through very complex, I don't know, hopefully you can see this, very complex rhythmic values. Let me try and expand this a bit. So this is the first example I want to show, and then after that, another exploration of resonances from Linda Catlin Smith, and really she's exploring this continual sound from the bass of the instrument, and the bass is wonderful because the sustain is very long, and you have this wonderful expansion of sound, and she's really going to she's wanting to sort of explore all the little varieties of color and all the subtleties that you can get out of the instrument. So I'll play first the Brice Posay, just a short section, and then I will play the Linda Catlin Smith. continued on to the next page. Sorry, I didn't turn it for you. But he has these wonderful, really long melismatic passages that sort of create this busy activity and then stretches out into a chord. And it's quite a lovely exploration of these different sonorities he's looking for. The other piece I will show is a short bit from this piece by Linda Catlin Smith, Sleeping Lady. And it's towards the end, and it's these deep harmonies, as I mentioned. And for me, it's nice because I can really play these chords and really respond to the resonance I'm getting to the room, respond to the resonance I'm getting from the instrument, and really progress through this on my own pace. And it's almost, I sort of suspend time for myself and really just play with these pieces of sound. So this is from Linda Catlin Smith. I think a really wonderful sound world that she creates with the harpsichord. And in this case with arpeggiation, I really like sort of the massiveness of a huge 10, 12 note chord being played all at once, and occasionally a quick arpeggiation that creates sort of just a bit different variety of bloom to the sound. So this is sort of the end of stuff I wanted to talk about. There are other considerations I wanted to mention, but maybe we'll leave for another time. In terms of tuning the instrument, in terms of tuning possibilities, microtonality, preparations, and inside the harpsichord stuff, there are some options. It's lighter strings, so it requires lighter preparations, but there are some possibilities. Electronics is another thing that a lot of people have worked with. There's a quasi-electronic sound from the instrument that blends quite well. At the same time, there's sort of a nice interplay with sort of expanding the harpsichord sound world through the electronic medium. And there's always the question of practicality with all those three subjects, because tuning can change very quickly, and inside the harpsichord stuff can change the tuning very easily, but those are sometimes worth breaking. Lastly, I wanted to show just a couple of references. There's a book here called I don't know if it's backwards, but I'll read it. It's called Harpsichord and Clavichord Music of the 20th Century. It's a book by Francis Bedford, and it's essentially a reference of pieces, you won't see this at all, pieces from throughout the 20th century. There's like over thousands of pieces in here with publisher, with dates, with performers from the beginning of the harpsichord revival until around 1993 when this was published. And it's a great reference. I'll write it in the comments or we'll post it somewhere so that if people are interested in finding harpsichord repertoire to explore, contemporary repertoire, you can use that as a real great references. It's sort of a Bible for contemporary harpsichord. The other one I have is a similar one, but specifically for Italian music up until 2005 when it was published. So there's a lot of music out there and a lot of interesting things that people have done with harpsichord, and I think a lot of possibilities for new things to arise. I think that's all I have to say, and I would like to leave the last 20 minutes to questions or comments, or if you want to hear more harpsichord, I can do that too.
Well, thank you, Wesley. We do have a bunch of questions here, and I'm going to try and do this the best I can here. So let's start with something that's rather specific. Is it standard to play in 4/15 even for contemporary music, or are some harpsichords in 4/38 or 4/40, for example?
Yeah, so a lot of tunings are possible. It really depends on who you're playing with. So if you're writing contemporary music for early instruments, oftentimes 4/15 is the standard. For early music, 392 is another standard, so a whole tone lower than modern pitch. But a lot of harpsichords can transpose to 440 by shifting the whole keyboard up one note. And so you can sort of transfer to 440 and play with modern instruments, play just at 440 alone. It really depends on the instrument, is really the dictating factor.
Excellent. Okay. Would it be useful for composers to write in the performance notes that performers should feel free to use the rubato to enhance phrasing, or will it be assumed that the performer will do that?
Can you repeat that question? Sorry.
Would it be useful for composers to write in the performance notes that performers should feel free to use rubato to enhance phrasing, or is it safe to assume that performers will just do that?
I think it's partially assumed. It really depends on the type of piece and the aesthetic of the piece. In some cases, more rubato seems more allowed based on the piece itself, and in other cases, less rubato is needed or less rubato is fitting. It really depends on the quality of piece and the sort of aesthetic that you're looking for the quality of expression that you're looking for. With Linda's piece, for example, she does write that it's quasi like that it is rubato and to sort of freely arpeggiate chords as you want. And sort of the piece itself, the melodic content invites that. Whereas other pieces, for example, the ligeti or the Mannkopf sort of doesn't demand that, and a lot of it is either written in or not necessary to the expression of the piece. So I guess the question is, it depends. The answer is it depends.
Yeah, and there's another question that's kind of in the same vein here. In terms of dynamics and articulations, how much detail would you say a composer should include? Do you have a preference between prescribed intent versus finding your own interpretation? And how does it relate to your own experience with Baroque music and contemporary music?
That's a question. That's a good question. It's a thing I've been dealing with a lot and thinking about a lot because I've come across pieces that use all variety of things, and in some cases it works well, some cases it really doesn't. Articulation is always great. It really does give ideas, but at the same time, sort of, I will take sometimes flexibilities with how I interpret those articulations. Because, for example, we only have, say, staccato, tenuto, accent, legato, and we sort of have a limited number of notational possibilities, and I will generally look for a larger continuum of possibilities. So interpretation becomes sort of, as with any interpretation, I guess, becomes the thing of interpreting the score. But I've come across pieces that have a lot of articulated notes, and in some places I'm like, I don't need to see this, I know it already. Other places it's like, okay, that was good to know that you want it very staccato or very legato on the other side. Again, it really depends. It's about the communication with the performer, and I think of it like any other instrument and put in sort of the info and allow for the interpretive part to come in as well. Dynamics, I've also found sometimes they are very useful because it gives an idea of the character more than actual volume level. And so if I see something forte, I will play it with a forte character, whereas if something's piano, I'm going to look for a piano character. So if you mention that those dynamics are for characteristic or character versions, or if you find character ways of writing it other than using dynamic markings, that's also a possibility. It's always tricky because you get a harpsichord score and you see dynamics, and the first instinct is that, oh, the composer doesn't know that the harpsichord can't make dynamics. But some people have put them in and they're useful. Otherwise, it's up to me to deduce that from the music itself almost, and hopefully be in conversation with the composer themselves and talk about that. But yeah, it's a problem that I've not found a solution for in terms of notation. And I think it's a challenge with any contemporary music, is finding the right notation for what they're trying to tell us and how much information to give.
I'm just going to say there's been a request to have the names of the books you mentioned typed into the chat.
I can do that, definitely.
It's just so that, and Catherine, maybe I can task you with, if Wesley does it in Zoom, copying that information into the Facebook one.
Sure, I'll do that at the end, I guess, when we finish the questions.
Perfect, excellent, thank you. Here, let's, Would you say your playing technique differs significantly when performing new music versus early music? How do you deal with or feel about that as a performer?
I feel like in some ways my technique changes quite a bit. Um, I feel like sometimes I have to expand my technique when I approach contemporary music because I am often looking for sounds that are beyond what you would in early music practice. So looking for some of those aggressive, some of those non-beautiful, I guess is not the best word for it, but looking sometimes for those very loud, aggressive sounds, looking to create not nice sounds. And sometimes the actual technique of leaping around the keyboard or playing chords that are not tonal changes how I have to play. But a lot of the expressive tools maybe are similar, and sort of thinking about those dimensions of articulation, the dimension of rubato, the dimension of time and arpeggiation are sort of the four-dimensional, five-dimensional world that you're living in when you're trying to shape and articulate a phrase or a gesture. The other thing that changes a lot is that the information that I'm gaining from the score is often more prescribed based on performance practice with early music, and so that the time signature, the type of gesture really indicates exactly what I need to do based on this is a figure that reflects a gavotte, and a gavotte has this feel and this rhythm, and that's going to be this type of expression. Or there's really a harmonic drive to the music in early music that dictates a lot of choices, whereas new music is about discovering and figuring out those choices despite maybe the lack of historically prescribed performance practice. Yeah.
Here's one that has personally tripped me up in the past, moving from one keyboard to a different keyboard. Could you talk about the reach on the harpsichord versus the piano?
The reach is roughly the same. The keys can be a little bit smaller. That is another thing that depends on the instrument. So a lot of Italian instruments have a very wide key. And so for me, I struggle sometimes even to reach a ninth when I can normally reach a tenth or wider. On a French instrument like this one, the reach is, the keys are a little bit thinner, but not so much so that you notice a significant change in the span. The other challenge is that on piano, it's very easy to sneak over and not hit the key that's in the way. Whereas on the harpsichord, it's very easy to hit wrong notes. And so even if you can reach a tenth on a piano, sometimes the D, like from C to E, the D is just going down a little bit but not sounding. Whereas on the harpsichord, it'll probably play and you'll get an extra note in there. So it's generally best just to think of the range, the span, as the same as on piano, and also just more wrong notes. And I guess in terms, sorry, continuing the question, in terms of the two manuals, facility over the two manuals is quite easy, and that's generally something I will decide whether I want to, if I'm playing on two manuals, if I want to reach over with this hand to get to the high register, or whether I want to just move this hand up this way, and sort of both of these things are quite easy and comfortable. Playing continuously like this is not so nice, but then I would just switch the hands and play it like this. But sort of facility over the two keyboards is fine. There's been a number of pieces where I have to play on both keyboards at the same time, or I choose to do so. And that's a little bit more limiting and not always nice to write, but if you talk to the person and talk to the harpsichordist and see what they're able to do, then there's sort of a lot of possibilities.
Excellent. I'm going to combine a couple questions here because they all seem to be asking similar stuff. What are some things that you would like to see in new compositions for the instrument? Are there areas you feel haven't been explored? And along with that, what are some unique instrument combinations to consider for harpsichord?
Great question. The challenge I find with contemporary music is a lot of people latch on to, this is a very specific choice of things, but a lot of people latch on to continuum. And so you end up with a lot of new music that is sort of the hands on top of each other and this very dense textural thing. And it is very exciting and can be done, I guess, ad infinitum. if we want to, but I would love to find some other textures to explore and really explore something different in music. Especially, there aren't a lot of slow pieces for harpsichord. I think, especially when you're not encountering a harpsichord in person, you think of short sustain, sharp attack, and so you think fast music is best. But there is actually a lot of resonance out of a lot of instruments, and to explore that slower side of things can be quite interesting. So those are maybe two things I'm interested in seeing. For me as well, I find a lot of electronic music with harpsichord quite derivative. There's a lot of, again, sort of combining textural tremolos, textural things on the harpsichord with electronic sounds, and to find more inventive ways of combining those two would be really exciting to me. The last part of the question for combinations, there's a lot of things that harpsichord works quite well with. Balance is always a thing, but there's always the opportunity to, especially with contemporary music, to amplify, and there's ways of tastefully amplifying where it's really just boosting the general volume, not really making a new sound to it. But at the same time, the timbre is so direct and so unique that it does actually cut through surprisingly well. Interesting combinations, marimba and harpsichord I've heard, which sounds quite cool. Vibraphone and harpsichord is also quite cool, both this metallic quality to it. I've heard of a piece, I think by John Beckwith for harpsichord and banjo, which I find quite funny. Maybe should be explored more, who knows. The other one I would love to explore as well is harpsichord and piano. I think it's an interesting combination. There are some challenges to that, but I think it's always an interesting thing to explore and to really explore that relationship that we all have in our mind of those two instruments. I think I can think of endless combinations of instruments that would be exciting. Percussion and harpsichord works very well. I could go
on. Thank you. We only have a little bit of time left here, so I'm going to try and get through these last three questions I have here. Is it common to amplify the harpsichord either in solo or ensemble situations, or in different ways with electronic processing?
Yes, so amplifying I have had to do. Sometimes it's born more out of necessity than desire, just because of the sake of balance. So oftentimes amplifying is done in larger ensembles. Again, there are ways of doing it where it doesn't sound necessarily amplified. It sort of just gives a general boost to the overall sound. So it's sort of creating a larger acoustic sound rather than making it an amplified harpsichord. I'm always experimenting with how to amplify it because mic placement can really change the quality of the amplification. The closer you get to the instrument, the more noise and the more plucking sound you get, which isn't always desirable and isn't always what you experience from further away. So it's always about finding that placement where you get more of the actual sound, less of the mechanics, but then also you don't have to worry about bleeding with other instruments and stuff. But it is done, it is possible. It does help in larger and more complex instrument and ensemble combinations. Yes, and then electronics, live processing can be great. Again, I've done some experimentations with Mac myself, and going back to the continuum thing is sort of layering polyphonic layers of harpsichord and creating even a more dense sound than what can be done alone. The pitch of a harpsichord is quite clean in some ways, almost sine wavy at times, which can be exciting to process with. On the opposite end, it also has a lot of rich harmonics, high overtones, which can also be something interesting to explore with in terms of any sort of spectral analysis or spectral transformation. And it combines well with a lot of sounds in that it does sound electronic-y itself and can be processed as such, but also cuts through potentially a dense cloud of electronic sound in the fact that it does have a very clear, direct attack and sound to it in its acoustic form. I think that was all the questions in that.
Yeah. Thank you. So I have one about repertoire and one about some techniques here. So I think I'm going to ask the technique one, but this might be, if you feel this is too large for now, maybe we can we can put people in contact with one another. It sounds like somebody was lucky enough to get their own harpsichord here, and they want to write for others. And the first question is, they're unsure if rapid repeated notes causes problems with the mechanism, and they're trying to decide if that's something specific to their instrument or if that's common across all harpsichords.
It's fairly common. There's sort of a maximal limit of repetition, mostly because you have to wait for so it plucks up, and then when you let go, you have to wait for it to come down and clear the string. And so there is sort of a maximum limit that depends even from key to key on the instrument, and that is sort of a pervasive harpsichord thing. On double manuals, sometimes you can cheat by repeating on the two manuals. So you repeat between the two manuals with two hands, or with one hand sometimes is possible, to get a faster repeat. But generally, yeah, there is an upper limit of repetition, and it's not always possible. For example, on this instrument here, you almost get, if I repeat too quickly, you'll get dead sounds in between, and the repetition breaks, because it's just not enough time for it to clear the string again and pluck. So it's a factor to consider. But even then, sometimes going towards that upper limit of repetibility and getting to the point where it is breaking can be a very exciting moment, where it really breaks at the point where the instrument is breaking itself, if that's an expression that's desired. Otherwise, yeah, the two manual thing can work for repetition, faster repetition. Yeah.
Excellent. The second part of that question was, and I know we could probably do an entire session on extended techniques, but do you have a couple that you would recommend that are not so invasive? Maybe your favorite ones, or?
Yeah, harmonics are possible. The challenge with extended techniques is that because the damper is attached to the jack, it means that the strings are always, there's no way of releasing the damper so the strings are freely ringing. Some instruments have a possibility when you disengage a set of strings so that it's not being played by the keyboard, that the dampers move off the strings. But those are sort of, those are again instrument dependent. But the other problem is that to press a key, you can't really press a key silently, or it takes more effort to press a key silently, where you have to manually push the string a little bit out of the way or mute it and then press the key down, because the plucking is always in the way, shall we say. But harmonics are definitely a possibility, and those are some beautiful sounds that you can get. Let me find the first harmonic. I don't know how well that's audible.
They're coming through really beautifully.
And so you can get some quite delicate sounds. The challenge is, again, the action sound, the plucking is quite loud comparatively, but at the same time you make that part of the overall sound. This is something I might move the camera to show. I can get it off. Just a sec. There you go. So hopefully this is not too motion sickness inducing. So here's the inside of the harpsichord. And you can see over here, there's the back bridge. So the strings stretch across this bridge here. Where am I reaching? Here. And on the other side, they are quite freely ringing. So you can get this kind of harpy sound. The other effect I do like is with a super ball mallet, you can sometimes get some nice squeaky sounds on the low bass. You can even do it sometimes with your finger. The dependability of those effects are variable at best. Let me get it back on. So they're challenging to get on command all the time, but they are some interesting effects. Again, practicality, people don't always like touching the harpsichord strings because they are so fine and they're prone to corrosion and stuff, but I mean, all strings on any instrument are prone to that, so sometimes it's worth the sacrifice. If it's my own instrument, I'd be happy to. If I'm playing other instruments, I might be less likely to, depending on whose instrument it is and what state it's in.
Fantastic.
Those are a few of my favorites, anyways.
Excellent. I have one very last question. I know we're coming up right against our last minute here, but what are some of the most polyphonic music for harpsichord you know? And polyphonic in a wide sense, like multi-layered or complexity.
That I've encountered, that's a tough question. For solo harpsichord, I guess, to some of the extreme, I would say Xenakis, in some sections of his harpsichord works, he has 5 to 7, sometimes 8 lines going on at the same time. They don't always sound as counterpuntal, more so as textural, but sort of written down as counterpoint. That's a tough question.
Well,
I'll have to ponder that one.
excellent. Well, Wesley, I really want to thank you for being with us today and answering questions and showing us around the instrument as you did today.
It's my pleasure. And if anyone ever has questions, please get in touch or contact your local harpsichordist. And when you have a chance, please go and experience a harpsichord in person and experience the touch and the possibilities that you can get with a live harpsichord. But yeah, stay in touch. If you have any questions, please ask them towards me. I think my email is probably somewhere, or my Facebook page, or something's on some of the info, and I can answer them as best as I can. And I hope that I've inspired some people to come and hopefully write some pieces, work with me, work with others. Yeah.
Thanks, Wesley. Thanks so much. That was really wonderful. Just a reminder, if you could send me the names of those books, definitely. And I'll put it in the chat here, but I'll also put it on the Facebook chat in the event for anybody that has to leave and can't wait.
Great. I'll write them in the chat right after we conclude, I guess.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wonderful. And just as a very last thing, I really want to thank Catherine Knowles and Christopher Mayo, who are both people that are working behind the scenes here. That you've heard Catherine's voice a couple of times here. Christopher Mayo wasn't able to join us, but they've done so much work at organizing all of these chats. I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us today and your questions, and I hope you found something interesting, something that you want to explore in your own writing here. And as a last note, please do check out our Facebook page and our website for information about upcoming webinars, and the way Facebook events there are up there for the next ones coming up soon. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday.
I just want to offer also a thanks to everyone for coming. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Catherine. Also, thank you to the composers. Some of the pieces that I showed today, Linda Callan-Smith, Anna Hossman, Monica Pierce, who I've worked with, and who have written wonderful works. So thank you to them too.
Take care. Wonderful. Thank you, Wesley.
Oh, I turned my camera off. Sorry.
Oh, that's fine.
Let me go back to one that's less awkwardly placed. There you go. That's better. I'm just going to write the names in.